Okay, this time we got Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. I think it was, written in 2003. So, probably the most contemporary book we've read, which is cool. So, yeah, let's get into it. The answer is yes, and that's it. So, what'd you guys think?
Amazing. So yeah, could we
Um,
have a 5-minute break so I can go drug myself because I'm coughing again?
yeah, yeah.
That's fine.
By the way, guys, if I'm listening to this, like and subscribe me in the video now, right? Right?
Can you say that again?
For the boys who are listening to this on YouTube, like and subscribe. We're gonna end the video now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like and sub. We're going for those YouTube shorts, I guess.
Juicy views.
We gotta capture the TikTok audience.
Yeah, yeah. Go to the youngs.
Just do like the Family Guy method where you just upload a whole podcast just in 15-second chunks.
Is that really what they
How
do?
to get views.
That's insane. Okay. So I felt compelled to put this in here just for the YouTube audience as well as, I guess, anyone in this chat. But yeah, if you did not read it, just FYI that there are some pretty gnarly things in this book, especially with SA, rape, and physical abuse, etc., that happens inside prisons. So that's mostly chapter 4, although it's sort of sprinkled throughout. So yeah, just FYI, if you are planning on reading this, it's pretty wild out there. All right. These are the chapters. We'll just be going through each one. All right. The first one is all about prison reform or prison abolition. So if y'all haven't picked up on the sort of reference to Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, which we also read, this is just reform or abolition. Pretty similar. So yeah, that's how she's sort of framing this argument, right? So I'll start with this, where she says, at bottom, there's one fundamental question. Why do we take prison for granted? While a relatively small proportion of the population has ever directly experienced life inside of a prison, this is not true in poor Black and Latino communities. Neither is it true for Native Americans or for certain Asian American communities. But even among those people who must regrettably accept prison sentences, especially young people, as an ordinary dimension of community life, it is hardly acceptable to engage in serious public discussions about prison life or radical alternatives to prison. It is as if prison were an inevitable fact of life, like birth and death. So, and the other thing, I guess, it's similar vibes to the, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism meme, except this just replaced capitalism with prisons. And right, it's hard to get through to people like, hey, what if there weren't any prisons? That'd be kind of wild, right? Like, it's hard. A lot of people are just so resistant to that, even as an idea.
The question that imposes itself is reform prisons to what? Like, what do you want to get out of prisons exactly? Because the virtue of prison by itself is just a what do you call it? Like punishment. It is not reformative. So reform it to what? To reformative kind of stuff? Well, it's not prison anymore. Right?
The irony is that prison was the reform. It used to just be like all capital punishment is just murder. You just like execute people
Yeah.
like did shit wrong, especially under like monarchy, right? It's just like, who cares? Just kill them, or do some other like heinous like punishment, just kind of like immediate, like retributive, just forms of punishment that didn't have, especially under like feudal systems, right? It's pretty much just whatever the king says goes, and they would just be like, all right, I don't know, cut off his arm or something, like that'll teach him a lesson. Or yeah, like any number of execution methods were used. And so like I think during Enlightenment era, where they're like, oh no, the death penalty, that's like when you first start getting like the death penalty is like too harsh. It's the prison is sort of introduced as like, oh well, we can, instead of just holding people temporarily for execution in a prison, which is what they used to be used for, was just like a holding cell while you may or may not have gotten a trial. They just put you in there until they killed you, or whatever other one-time violence was committed against you. Instead, they're like, what if we just kept them in there for a number of years or months equal to the crime? And as we'll get to in a little bit, that has to do with the rise of capitalism, because suddenly measuring time in terms of like socially necessary labor time, in other words, like a sentence is equal to a certain amount of work, then you start having the prison emerge as like this new reformist method of punishment that's much more civilized. All right. So let's keep going. As important as some reforms may be, the elimination of sexual abuse and medical neglect in women's prison, for example, frameworks that rely exclusively on reforms help to produce the stultifying idea that nothing lies beyond the prison. Debates about strategies of decarceration, which should be the focal point of our conversations on the prison crisis, tend to be marginalized when reform takes the center stage. The most immediate question today is how to prevent the further expansion of prison populations and how to bring as many imprisoned women and men as possible back into what the prisoners called the free world. Yep. Pretty similar argument, just, hey, if we're framing everything around reform, it's kind of hard to talk about abolition or revolution or whatever you want to call it, right? It's, hey, why don't we have, instead of making these existing prisoners' lives like slightly less awful, what about just fewer prisoners or none? That would be cool. But that would require probably enormous scale systemic changes that actually address people's crumbling material conditions, and you know how liberals feel about that. It's not their thing.
Well, yeah, because it is just like preventative medicine. It is the only actual way forward, but if you're gonna do it, you're gonna have to change the whole status quo, which is unacceptable for a liberal.
Yep. The other thing I remember bringing up to, I think it might have been was it my cousin? Something like that. Second cousin. I don't know. Well, I think he's my second cousin. I don't know how those relations work. But anyways, he was pretty conservative, but I was talking to him about some of the stuff, and I brought up the old adage that I'm sure some of us have heard of, right? Where it's like, property is 9/10 of the law. Has anyone heard of that? It's kind of an old like adage, but in a lot of ways it's actually pretty accurate. I don't know if it's actually 9/10. I'm sure someone has done the math. But the point is that a ton of laws essentially boil down to what the state is all about, which is just protecting private property rights and private property as a social relation, basically. So many things that are illegal are only illegal because of private property. So that's one thing, right? We'll kind of get to this towards the end when they talk about like abolitionist solutions, or at least how to think about what might be beyond prisons. But one of the main ways is decriminalization, right? It's pretty simple. If we just make fewer things illegal, then we wouldn't have as many people in jail. I mean, drugs, sex work, alcohol, basic stuff. Well, alcohol was already, I guess, went through this process of being criminalized. It went really badly. Then they made it legal again, at least in America. And yeah, I think we're eventually going to look back on like basically drugs as a category and be like, yeah, it went through the same evolution as alcohol did, where they made it legal. It went really poorly for tons and tons of people, and then they made it legal again after enough public pressure. And we're going to look back as, oh, look at those silly politicians. Of course, it's much more sinister than that, because, as we'll get to, the prison industrial complex, which sort of sprang into existence around the same time that drugs were getting heavily criminalized, the whole quote-unquote war on drugs thing, that matches pretty nicely with the prison industrial complex in the 80s really kind of blowing up, which she talks about in this chapter a little bit. I know she uses California as a case study, but the general story is true across the U.S. and much of the world, at least where capitalism is thriving. Because, yeah, prisoners make really good workers, right? I mean, they can't unionize. They have barely any rights as it is, so you can treat them any way you feel like it. Yeah, it's a capitalist dream to have a bunch of prisoners who have no choice but to work for pennies, and they have basically no legal protections. So it's a very lopsided class struggle when it comes to prisons. All right. Chapter 2 is a little bit more about like the history of prisons, and again, this is very American centric, because that's sort of her subject of study, I suppose you could say. So she says the appalling treatment to which convicts were subjected under the lease system recapitulated and further extended the regimes of slavery. If, as Adam T. Hirsch contends, the early incarnations of the U.S. penitentiary system in the North tended to mirror the institution of slavery in many important respects, the post-Civil War evolution of the punishment system was in very literal ways the continuation of a slave system, which was no longer legal in the free world. The population of convicts, whose racial composition was dramatically transformed by the abolition of slavery, could be subjected to such intense exploitation and to such horrendous modes of punishment precisely because they continued to be perceived as slaves. So yeah, I guess what she's pointing out is that, even after the Civil War, where, like the liberals will constantly point out, is that, America did a good thing because slavery was abolished. You'd be like, well, hold on there, cowboy, because after that, right, in the North, you've got the prison system popping up, and that becomes a de facto slave system, which, by the way, and I know she mentions it in this, right, but like the 13th Amendment, I guess, the one that bans slavery, conveniently leaves a glaring loophole that says, actually, slavery is totally fine as long as they're prisoners, as long as it's part of some sort of punishment. So slavery is actually legal in the United States to this day, just under very specific conditions. And don't be surprised that the capitalists, early though they were, took advantage of this. So yeah, you start getting the punishment system, the penitentiary system, and in the North it kind of resembled the slave system. And then she says, well, actually in the South it was somehow even worse, or as I should say, continuation of slavery, because black people are already sort of viewed that way in the South. These things don't shift overnight, even if you do lose the Civil War. So yeah, they found new ways of doing it, and that loophole. I'm really curious if someone's done a detailed history, because I don't know the history of that loophole in the 13th Amendment. Like if that was some sort of concession to like southern states or something. Because it seems really bizarre that they just were like, oh yeah, slavery's bad, unless they're prisoners, in which case it's fine.
I think a lot of the senators and representatives from the South like voted on that amendment still, and like still had power in the houses of government even right after the Civil War, so they could still influence what it said.
Yeah, I'm sure someone knows. This is probably well documented, I would imagine. It's a pretty touchy subject, but it's somewhat surprising, though. I know it's like easy to just be like, oh well, they're capitalists, so like, why is it surprising? But that seems low and like I guess hypocritical even for them. But I don't know. Okay. All right. Imprisonment and reform. This is chapter 3. She says, moreover, the prison sentence, which is always computed in terms of time, is related to an abstract quantification, evoking the rise of science and what is often referred to as the Age of Reason, or, like I said earlier, the Enlightenment. We should keep in mind that this is precisely the historical period when the value of labor began to be calculated in terms of time, and therefore compensated in another quantifiable way, by money. The computability of state punishment in terms of months, years, resonates with the role of labor time as the basis for computing the value of capitalist commodities. Marxist theories of punishment have noted, or theorists of punishment have noted, that precisely the historical period during which the commodity form arose is the era during which penitentiary sentences emerged as the primary form of punishment. So there you have it, folks. The material conditions affect the way human society is organized. Shocker. So yes, as you have labor power become a market commodity that every capitalist is slobbering and drooling over to exploit as much as possible, you look at these prisoners and so forth, and you probably ask yourself as a capitalist, like, wait a minute, why would we just kill these people? It seems like a terrible waste. We should put them to work and pay them nothing. So, or next to nothing at least. I know, like, the liberal in the walls will be like, oh, well, technically prisoners get paid, so it isn't literally slavery, but I think they get paid like literally $1 an hour or something like laughably small.
The minimum wage, I think, is between 19 cents and 25 cents.
Yeah. I know, I'm almost positive it's not federal minimum wage. Or if they do get paid federal minimum wage, it's probably an exception to the rule rather than the rule. But yeah, this is a really good observation. I guess not from Davis alone. She just mentions Marxist theorists of punishment. I'm not totally sure who those people are, but regardless, it's a really interesting, observation of a materialist perspective on prisons, where, it makes sense that the form of punishment might mirror the way the economic base of society is organized. So, interesting. All right, next she says, if we combine Howard's emphasis on disciplined self-reflection with Bentham's ideas of regarding the technology of internalization designed to make surveillance and discipline the purview of the individual prisoner. By the way, that's just referring to, I guess it was Bentham's panopticon, is what I think that's what she's referring to in this passage. So just for anyone who did not read that part, or doesn't know what the panopticon is, it was a hypothetical originally, but I guess someone actually, or the first attempt at making one was in America, but it is a prison that is designed such that no prisoner can see another prisoner or the wardens or the guards. You can't even, like, basically any prisoner cannot see anybody else. However, the warden, or like the guard sitting in the middle of this sort of circular complex, can see all the prisoners, and therefore the prisoner essentially lives in this constant state of permanent surveillance. But the surveillance may or may not be there. You may or may not be being watched. I mean, just all of you in the chat, like, think about how horrible that would be to live your life as if someone is constantly watching you, and not just like any someone. I mean, like a prison warden, basically. I mean, regardless, like, it's just like a pretty monumental lack of privacy at the, surface level, I guess. But it's also just like psychological torture, basically, on top of a really good way to keep an eye on all your prisoners, I guess, if you're the warden or whatever. But yeah, it's kind of fucked up. So she's talking about, okay, if we have a panopticon situation, so she says, we can begin to see how such a conception of the prison had far-reaching implications. The conditions of possibility for this new form of punishment were strongly anchored in a historical era during which the working class needed to be constituted as an army of self-disciplined individuals, capable of performing the requisite industrial labor for developing capitalist system. So, right, think about a bunch of workers in the factory or whatever, doing their thing. It's really difficult for like a supervisor, or just the capitalists themselves, whatever, to like keep an eye on everyone and maintain certain levels of discipline and make sure they get as much work squeezed out of them as possible. The prison is like that, but cranked up to 11, because the workers, in this case the prisoners, like, they literally can't leave. They get driven to the factory or whatever they're doing, whatever work they're doing, because not all prison labor is like factory work or whatever. I know that's kind of the cliche, but I think she even mentions like the prisoners doing like clerical work for, oh god, was it Chase Bank or something? I can't remember which institution it was, or was it Chevrolet maybe? I don't know. I can't remember the example she gives. It's in there somewhere, but I think she gives the example of them literally like just typing numbers into spreadsheets, basically. Just like, boring, mindless work. That, like, it's pretty straightforward labor. There's not much to it, I guess. That's the kind of shit they have them do. But yeah, like I said, kind of more materialist analysis of why the current prison form is the way it is, and why prison labor exists in the first place, not just, it doesn't just spring out of nowhere, right? I mean, this comes from capitalist development. All right. Next, how gender structures the prison system. She says, however, the economic and political shifts of the 1980s, the globalization of economic markets, the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, the dismantling of such social service programs as aid to families of dependent children, and, of course, the prison construction boom, produced a significant acceleration in the rate of women's imprisonment both inside and outside the United States. In fact, women remain today the fastest growing sector of the U.S. prison population. This recent rise in the rate of women's imprisonment points directly to the economic context that produced the prison industrial complex, and that has had a devastating impact on men and women alike. So, this is, I guess, one of the more recent developments in the history of prisons. Is, much. Obviously, she points to a whole bunch of stuff leading or influencing this increase in the women prison population. But in general, I guess what I find another like parallel, just or sort of in general, right, is just women entering the workforce writ large, right? So this was sort of happening and accumulating since maybe like the 40s or 50s, and that trend has been the case because, women are not immune from the material conditions which they live in, and so working class women are just as vulnerable to going to prison as anyone else. Although I'm aware that the numbers of women in prison are much smaller than men overall, but the proportion, I guess, like she says, the proportion of women going to prison is increasing more rapidly than any other sector of the population. So, yeah, kind of depressing stuff. Let's see. So next, she says, as the level of repression in women's prisons increases, and paradoxically, as the influence of domestic prison regimes recedes, so a sexual abuse which, like domestic violence, is yet another dimension of the privatized punishment of women, has become an institutionalized component of punishment behind prison walls. Although guard on prisoner sexual abuse is not sanctioned as such, the widespread leniency with which offending officers are treated suggests that for women, prison is a space in which the threat of sexualized violence that looms in the larger society is effectively sanctioned as a routine aspect of the landscape of punishment behind prison walls. So I think what she's getting at here when she says the domestic prison regimes, I think that's sort of like her way of saying, the previous mode of like imprisoning women, quote unquote, it was basically, monogamous marriage. The woman stays in the house doing all the housework, unpaid, obviously, rearing children, etc. But now, fast forward, women are now in the workforce in full force, essentially, and now they're also being imprisoned much more. The irony is that their life in prison is sort of just like an amplified, more hellish version of their quote-unquote domestic prison life or regime, where you still have physical abuse, you still have sexual abuse, and obviously you still cannot escape it because you're literally in prison. Where else are you? Literally, there's nowhere for you to go. And in many, many cases, the offending officers are, like she says, it's sort of like if they get caught, it's a slap on the wrist. like, hey, knock it off, you know, get back to work, instead of like treating it like the crime it actually is. Yeah, pretty dark. And obviously this does have a lot of overlap with the police as well. You know, prison guards and police are sort of best buds. In fact, I think they probably all like know each other and shit in any given jurisdiction. So yeah, I guess that comes with the territory of just being a shithead. But yeah, prison guards, I think ACAB applies. All right. Next, the prison industrial complex. The fact, for example, that many corporations with global markets now rely on prisons as an important source of profit helps us to understand that the rapidity with which prisons began to proliferate precisely at a time when official studies indicated that the crime rate was falling. The notion of a prison industrial complex also insists that the racialization of prison populations, and this is not only true of the US, but of Europe, South America, and Australia as well, is not an incidental feature. So now we're starting to put some of the pieces together here of what this prison industrial complex is all about. It is about profit, obviously. The prison supplies the labor, the industrial, which is capital, supplies the capital and equipment and tools and shit that the prisoners work with and do shit with, and boom, you get profit, right? That's basically the formula. And yeah, wages, what's that? We barely need to pay anything. Maybe we'll buy the lads lunch or whatever, you know. So yeah, that's pretty much. She's getting right to the source. Really, it's not surprising that corporations are behind it. And indeed, actually, I think she talks about it a little bit, although not as much, because I think I guess in 2003 there just weren't as many private prisons. However, nowadays I think there are many more that have sprung up in the recent decades since this was written, and those are a whole nother bag of, or can of worms, I guess you could say, because I believe their contracts stipulate that basically they get state funding based on the number of prisoners they have, and the more prisoners they have, the more money they make, basically. So I wonder if they have any material incentive whatsoever to rehabilitate prisoners at all. Curious. Perhaps not. Okay. A more cogent way to define the relationship between the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex would be to call it symbiotic. These two complexes mutually support and promote each other, and in fact often share technologies. Both systems generate huge profits from processes of social destruction. Precisely that which is advantageous to those corporations, elected officials, government agents, who have obvious stakes in the expansion of these systems, begets and devastation for poor and racially dominated communities in the U.S. and throughout the world. The transformation of imprisoned bodies, and they are in the majority of bodies of color, into sources of profit, who consume and also often produce all kinds of commodities, devours public funds, which might otherwise be available for social programs such as education, housing, childcare, recreation, and drug programs. So yeah, someone, maybe I should have made like the Predator meme where they're like the handshake meme, where you got the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex are best buds, because like she says, not only do they support each other, and share all their cool gadgets with each other. You know, the ones that you use to oppress human beings and make their lives a misery. There's just tons of weaponry, of course, as well. The fundamental operation of these two complexes is what she calls social destruction, right? Military-industrial complex makes money when you when you level countries, and you know, kill lots of people. Although ironically, I've always thought it was curious that, like, just like how what's it called, private prisons, like, want to maintain contracts by basically doing a really shitty job of being of like reforming people, so they essentially just don't. They just make everyone's lives a living hell, so that reform is never on the agenda. The irony, I think, with the military industrial complex is, like, they want to be at war, but they want to be really bad at it, so that the war is prolonged as long as possible. I'm looking at you, Afghanistan and Iraq. Those wars, at least, not the countries. Yeah, I mean, that's why those wars lasted so fucking long. Obviously, they shouldn't have happened in the first place, but the point of dragging it out, right, and, like, doing a shitty job of doing anything, it ultimately makes more money. So, yeah, the more prolonged and drawn out the social destruction, the better, I guess is what I'm saying, from the perspective of these industries. And then, yeah, I mean, of course, right, the devouring of public funding is also commonly lamented, and I know that might be a little bit more of a liberal argument, I guess you could say, but I think it is a good entry point for folks who haven't been exposed to this, like, abolitionist sort of approach to prisons, or really any sort of radical critique of the criminal justice system. You can start just somewhere as simple as, like, man, prisons sure do use a lot of public funds, right? That kind of sucks. If we use those funds for basic social programs, we'd probably have less prisoners and save money in the long run.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Preventative programs.
What was that again? You're a little mumbly.
Preventative social programs.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is just anything that spends public money that helps people just live their fucking lives in a normal way, like healthcare, childcare, housing, drug addiction programs that, like, help people who are having a hard time in general, right? Like basic social safety net shit is, like, the more you butcher that sort of infrastructure and divert funds away from it, the more people are forced into crimes of desperation, or just, it could just be, like, hardcore drug use when it comes to, like, what do they call it? Diseases of despair. I think you'll sometimes hear it called, of, like, turning to alcohol, turning to drugs as an escape from reality, basically, and then you get caught and boom, you're in jail. So yeah, these two things are very much linked, right? It is ultimately a choice of policy at the end of the day. Yeah, you can pretty clearly see what the neoliberal regime has chosen. It has chosen to slash everything to the bone. Let's just let all these private prisons handle it. Yeah, we'll see you guys in Malibu for Christmas. Huge Christmas party. It's going to be crazy. All right. Last chapter, abolitionist alternatives. If, however, we shift our attention from the prison, perceived as an isolated institution, to the set of relationships that comprise the prison industrial complex, it may be easier to think about alternatives. In other words, a more complicated framework may yield more options than if we simply attempt to discover a single substitute for the prison system. The first step then would be to let go of the desire to discover one single alternative system of punishment that would occupy the same footprint as the prison system. So the first answer she provides, or not answer, but suggestion for these abolitionist alternatives. Number one, don't pigeonhole yourself to one system, right? And I think this makes basic sense, hopefully. And I think, I'm sure some of you are, if you are familiar with this sort of thing, you'll sort of run into immediately the immediate pushback of like, oh, but what about the murderers and rapists, right? Like the worst offenses in society. What you might be able to respond to that with is, you don't have to propose a solution straight away. That's not what I'm saying, but you can at least say, hey, maybe we should not apply our method of punishment or imprisonment or whatever for the worst people to everybody, right? Because there are a lot of people in prison who are there for like no good reason, like really mild offenses. And it could be simple shit like they just can't afford the fine or they can't afford bail, so they're just in there for like way longer than they should be. Or, you know, thanks to like Joe Biden and shit, you've got people who are in jail for carrying around like barely any marijuana at all, but like boom, life sentence because Papa Joe said so. You know what I mean? Like that's at least one example of like, we do not need one unifying system that treats everyone as if they're the worst fucking people. We can delineate different types of sentences or punishments if we even want to punish people, because some things are, I think, worthy of like a slap on the wrist, where it's like, hey, that's kind of shitty of you, but you know, please don't do that again, and we won't have a problem. It's not, there's a lot of crimes that are not nearly on the same level. All right, next. So she says, if, however, we shift our attention from the prison, perceived as an isolated institution, to the set of relationships that comprise the prison industrial complex, it may be easier to think about alternatives. In other words, a more complicated framework may yield... I might have forgot to... Okay, yeah, no, I left the same quote. That's fine. I'll just read the second part. What then would it mean to imagine a system in which punishment is not allowed to become the source of corporate profit? How can we imagine a society in which race and class are not primary determinants of punishment, or one in which punishment itself is no longer the central concern in the making of justice? So these are just some questions she lays out as questions that need to be wrestled with and answered by the abolitionist movement, right? So first of all, the first question is the easiest, like imagining a system in which punishment is not a source of corporate profit. Well, that should be an easy one. An easy one to answer. How about we just don't imagine, any solution has to be divorced from profit. And then she says, race and class are not primary determinants of punishment. That one's pretty easy too, right? As long as you just eliminate class, that will help. And then, we got a lot of work to do with race as well, but should be pretty straightforward as long as you have the normal people in charge. the good old workers. And yeah, I think the next part, I think my next quote might be from on this a little bit more, but yeah, basically, if we're looking at justice, is punishment always, the appropriate course, right? It's just straight up punishing people for their mistakes or actions. An effective way of handling it, of actually coming to justice, is that really the right course? I think that's, that can be a tough one to answer, I think, for some people, I'm sure. I know there's lots of stories written, all like, you got the classic, like, oh, revenge never helps sort of theme. I'm sure you've probably heard a million times, but there is some truth to that, I think, with, if you're just seeking retribution and only retribution, like, are you actually achieving some sort of justice at the end of the day? That's a good question. Okay. In both these cases, and the cases she's talking to in this context were drugs and sex work, decriminalization would advance the abolitionist strategy of decarceration, that is, the consistent reduction in the number of people who are sent to prison, with the ultimate aim of dismantling the prison system as the dominant mode of punishment. A further challenge for abolitionists is to identify other behaviors that might be appropriately decriminalized as preliminary steps towards abolition. So I kind of teased this at the beginning, but it should be pretty obvious. The fewer, the more behavior is decriminalized, the fewer criminals you'll have. Coming sounds super obvious, but apparently not. And then she says there's a growing body of literature on reshaping systems of justice around strategies of reparation rather than retribution, as well as a growing body of experiential evidence of the advantages of these approaches to justice and of the democratic possibilities they promise. So yeah, we don't need to just punish, retribution. I just want to cause this person as much pain and suffering as possible to match, my pain and suffering, or whatever, or whoever the victim might be. We can look at it as sort of a debt you owe society. Like, you fucked up in some way or another, and you have to pay for it. However, that payment or the reparation does not have to be through it doesn't have to be through, number one, like, unpaid like labor that benefits a capitalist. Okay, because that is not actually helping society at all. That should not be controversial, at least not in this chat. Because going and working for a capitalist does not help society even a little bit. So that's not a good route. And I think there are some, I know there are, like, some programs where you've got, like, prisoners, like, cleaning up a roadside or something, like picking up trash. It's still not ideal, but that is at least some form of, like, community service, basically, that is a little more productive than either making profit for somebody or, I don't know, just fucking solitary or something that doesn't do anyone any good. So yep, that's pretty much it. That's what I got. There's more in there that I didn't cover, but yeah, that's some broad strokes at least.
One really big thing that it did not examine is the role of prison in society. Fundamentally, the role of prison is terrorizing society, so people to uphold the law, right? Um, and in America, it is a racist thing too, because of course everything is racist in America. Uh, while when you look at it in third world countries like Iraq and Syria and countries like these, there is um, torture prisons that are only there for the sole reason of terrorizing people. They are only there for the sole reason of making you fear not breaking the law, not doing bad things to society, but just being politically opposed to the ruling class. The prisons in general are generally tools of the ruling class to, rule class, and the terrorization that happens in, uh, let's say, Abu Ghraib, and the mass fear and the inability to seek justice from those who had uh, terrorized millions of people is one really important weapon in the hands of the state. So this alone should be enough of an incentive for you to seek the abolition of prisons, even if you do not agree that that locking up somebody in a room for 70 years is not okay.
I mean, there is a little bit in the book about that. I may not have covered it, but no, there is definitely some in there about how, right, like one, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the state, right, of like, I mean, look at Lenin's definition of like, special bodies of armed men. Prisons are a part of the state system, and especially the state system of like oppression and, like you said, the monopoly on violence. The prisons is in some ways an upgrade over just like capital punishment, like death sentences. Because death sentences, yeah, they're super brutal, but like they're quick at the very least. Now, there is definitely some reason to believe that like the long term like psychological damage of being isolated from society is way more frightening than just getting like killed instantly. um, in a lot of ways, like it does sound worse than death, to just be locked up forever. And that's why like the fucking anti-death penalty folks, I think their heart is in the right place, but they also just say, oh well, they should just get like, we should just give life sentences. It's like, okay, that might be like as cruel. At least.
Yeah, at least as cruel and or worse. Well, the thing is, like, if the state does not have the monopoly on power, this is the part that I was touching on. When the state does not have a monopoly on power, they will not uh, imprison people for labor. They will not imprison people to uphold the law. They will imprison people just to torture them, so they can scare uh, political descendants by that, as we have seen in Abu Ghraib, as we have seen in multiple prisons in multiple places.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Like if there's a power struggle, I guess you mean, like how to win a power struggle.
Civil war, for example.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that almost sounds like it almost sounds like a civil war situation, right? Where you've got competing power structures within a nation, and at that point, it might even be more comparable to like prisoners of war, like taking your opponents, and again, like I said, not just killing them, but like keeping them captive, torturing them for information, making their lives miserable as possible.
This is the thing. You, in the case of struggle for power in a state position, the state will not only start punishing the opposing side, the revolting side. The state will start cracking down on all political dissenters. If you go out of line for one policy, you will be in prison. And the conditions in prisons are like brutal would be a misrepresentation of it. We have here prisons in which you have one cell with 150 people in it. You have people who have like $1 for food for like a whole day. You have a system in which there is a incentive to literally capture kids to sell them as sex slaves in a market. This is how it goes when the struggle for power becomes just a matter of who can terrorize the population more so they can control it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll grant that Davis does not go into that with a lot of detail, or she doesn't like look at prisons from that perspective. She's definitely looking at prisons from the American perspective, like 100%. But I don't think she would disagree, and I don't disagree that prisons are like any like state apparatus is ultimately a method of social control, with the threat of violence ultimately that is what you use to control people.
Exactly.
And keeping people locked up is definitely a form of violence, for sure.
And I would say torture is violence, like
just a bit, yeah.
Like electrocuting people is generally considered violent in some places. There is not a consensus on it, but like most people say that it is.
Oh, I was being facetious. It definitely is.
Yeah. Well, that's why I am here. I am the third orderist in the room.
Yep. Well, I also, speaking of the abolitionist alternatives, I was also hoping that Davis would give a shout out to Mao, because wasn't he the one who made like the former emperor of China into like doing community service or something? I don't remember what it was.
Yes, he was a janitor, I think. Question mark.
Something like that, yeah.
Like that. Which was like, to be fair, just funny. Let's be fair, it was just funny.
Yeah, but hey, good on him for being like, you know what? We could make this dude's life a living hell, but let's just make him work off of his crimes for the rest of his life. You're just a worker now.
Yeah, that was a Chad move from Mao. Mao just chatted the whole thing. I think we're done now. you have anything else?
Yep. Anybody else? Questions, comments?
I do have two questions that came up in my mind about this. So my first question is, does the state get fined if businesses don't get enough prisoners? Reason why I'm asking this is because I heard it somewhere and I was wondering if this was true or not.
Does the state get fined?
Yeah.
Who fines the state? Like,
As I said, it was the private prisons.
oh, did they get fined if they don't have enough? No, I don't. They don't. It's not that they get punished for not having prisoners. It's that they get rewarded for having prisoners.
Oh, right.
Right. There's a slight difference there. It's basically, so I think the way it works is they have a contract with the state that says, hey, we will take care of a certain percentage or population of your prisoners, and in return for funding, public funds, right, and some sort of funding bill that pays for this. So they're getting paid with public money to take care of prisoners. Now, the size of the contract is proportional to the number of prisoners that they're taking care of. Each prisoner costs a certain amount of money. Therefore, and basically they have to have obviously they have a profit incentive. Therefore, they're going to want the largest contracts possible. You get the largest contracts possible by having as many prisoners for as long as possible. Therefore, why would you focus on rehabilitation and reform of prisoners when that directly cuts into your bottom line?
Right.
There is something called like lockup quotas that are similar to what Poot described, where the state, the government, whatever level, I assume state level, because I don't think the federal does that. I don't know, maybe, where they have to like fulfill X amount of beds in a prison, otherwise they have to pay the company.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I guess it depends on the contract in that case.
Which,
well, I think in most contracts in the United States, if you don't fill up the amount needed of beds in prison, you get you need to pay the penalties to the company that is managing the prison, let's say. So it's not a fine, it's a penalty.
I do have a second question.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you going to say something?
No.
My second question here is, what examples in law does private property make things illegal? Like, what examples are there?
Theft.
Yeah.
Squatting, trespassing. Let's see.
Loitering.
Yeah, I guess loitering is kind of like trespassing. Because, like, I mean, there are laws in other countries that I think it's called, like, right to roam. So there's laws in, I think it's like, Scotland's at least one I know of.
Right, yeah.
Sweden, Norway, Finland, Iceland, and Denmark all have it too.
Yeah, so these laws basically say that, like, you can walk right through someone's property with no legal repercussions, because as long as you don't intend to just, like, do any damage or steal anything. Like,
right.
If I can just cut through your backyard, basically. But in America, that's not allowed. That's instantly trespassing, and whoever owns that property is legally allowed to just kill you on the spot. it depends on the state, I guess, but for the most part, they can just shoot you and be like, "Well, they're on my property." Like,
Freedom.
yeah, like just literally just walking on someone's property is breaking the law, like by definition.
I'm allowed to murder you if you go across this dotted line.
All right, and so like that automatically makes just moving into a certain area illegal. I mean, that is like one of the textbook ways of making things, like why private property makes a lot of things illegal. Of course, there's also, like I said, they're like not just trespassing, like loitering, I guess. I mean, in a lot of places, they kind of effectively criminalize homelessness by making it so that like people cannot houseless people or homeless people like cannot rest anywhere, even if it's public property. Like they can just pass laws and just be like, okay, no one can be in this park after dark or whatever. So there's all kinds of laws like that basically just criminalize houseless people, homeless people, or just poor people in general who don't own anything. Yeah, it's pretty shitty.
Or they can just do policies that will lead to the harassment of poor and or homeless people.
Yeah, I mean, there's also just think about stuff like, how about like house insurance, home and like car insurance, anything like that. I mean, that's directly referencing private property, and there's all sorts of legal shit around that as well. So yeah, there's a lot of like basically the selling or buying of property is a lot of that's like a lot of what the legal system is about. And then the laws that come down to like don't mess with other people's property basically is like a big category, but they're, like I said, you can categorize them into a couple basic ones like theft, trespassing. Basically, private property is just an imaginary social construct that says this portion of the universe is reserved for me and me alone, and anybody who uses it without my consent and knowledge is going to get thrown in jail. Like, think about how insane that is.
And or shot.
Or yeah, I might just shoot you because I'm feeling frisky that day.
Freedom!
Yeah. I just have to wonder if these people, about folks that support this kind of stuff and go on to say they're compassionate. Like, it's kind of off topic, but I'm just thinking if that's the case for some folks, like especially for Christian folks.
Well, the thing is that they are just not like they are just not compassionate about anyone. They do not like they give a shit if you die or live. Like this is the whole point of having the private property still be allowed. Is that they actually do not give a shit if people die.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is kind of to echo Maha's point from earlier about prisons as a method of social control. Think about like how would you go about indoctrinating your children about private property? Like teaching them how it works, because private property is not natural, right? Like little tiny kids cannot comprehend it. because it doesn't make sense to them, right? Like if your kid, just imagine you have a little kid, they're scurrying around the backyard and they like run into the neighbor's yard. They just broke the law. But they don't know that. They don't know what's going. They don't know that's illegal. Like, the grass looks the same, right? Let's just pretend like there's no fence, right? Whatever. You have to indoctrinate your kids by telling them, hey, if you cross this imaginary line, then some big scary man is going to come and take you away and throw you in a dark room for years on end. I mean, that is like fucking traumatizing to like teach children for the first time. But and by the way, she does talk about this in the text, in the first chapter mostly, where she talks about like prison's depiction in media. So think about like TV shows, movies. Think about how many fucking like cop shows there are, like propaganda, right?
Yeah.
What is always included in these propaganda shows? Fucking prisons. There's constantly scenes of interrogating people in prisons, or going to pick people up in prison, drop people off of prison, whatever, or jail, prison, whatever. Mm-hmm. It happens all the time, and it's reinforcing how terrible prison is to the general population, so that they know, starting from, in a lot of cases, pretty young age, oh, I don't want to go to prison. That looks terrible. And it is terrible, to be clear. But like the indoctrination starts early. You have to teach young children this early, that they will get severely punished, like way more punished than their parents would ever do to them if they break the law in certain ways. So yeah, it is 100% a method of social control, and it's usually used in the wrong way. I know I brought this up last time, Maha, actually, and I think I can't remember what you said about it, but I mentioned something like moral systems, in my opinion, are also methods of social control, but not in like a malicious way. At least not always. It can always be used in a malicious way, but moral systems can also be used to maintain like a reasonable society, without any types of coercion other than just like social pressure, like peer pressure. But you know, I think they're legal systems and moral systems, both methods of control. Moral systems basically are just like social pressure to do the right thing, so to speak, whereas legal systems are do this thing or I'll torture you, punish you, imprison you. There's always a threat of violence behind a law, basically.
Right. I think one thing to mention, though, is that, especially within the United States, private property laws definitely affect more marginalized groups than white folks.
Everything does that in the United States.
Yeah.
Even fucking viruses.
Yeah.
Even diarrhea rates. Well, that's because I think white people don't eat fucking spices, but like still. Motherfucker puts salt in and say, oh, that's so spicy. Fuck you guys.
Yeah.